The coffee should have been brewing by 6 o'clock. Every Sunday, for nearly 15 years, the warm aroma reached the hallway long before the first veterans, widows, and hungry neighbors stepped through the doors of the Maple Grove Community Center. That morning, the kitchen was silent. The giant griddle remained cold. The biscuit dough had not been rolled, and one chair at the end of the stainless steel work table sat empty. Frank Dawson had never missed a single Sunday since he first unlocked this kitchen, yet his apron hung neatly on its hook, freshly washed, while a plain white envelope rested exactly where he always placed the day's menu. I stared at it without moving, because nothing about Frank Dawson's life had ever happened by accident. If you have ever wondered how one quiet act of service can nourish an entire community, I hope you'll stay with me. Sarah Collins reached the kitchen a few moments after I did, still carrying 2 grocery bags filled with fresh fruit. She looked around once, then looked again, as if the room itself had made a mistake. "Has anyone heard from Frank?" she asked. No one answered. Marcus Hill arrived next, balancing crates of eggs against his shoulder. The young Army veteran smiled out of habit until he noticed the untouched coffee urn. "He's probably running late," he said, though none of us believed it. Frank was always early enough to greet the sunrise before greeting people. For years, he joked that bacon tasted better when it had watched the morning arrive. We all laughed every time, even though he never changed the line. More volunteers filtered into the kitchen, each wearing the same expression of quiet concern. Some immediately reached for pans and mixing bowls, hoping routine might erase the growing uneasiness. Others stood near the doorway, glancing toward the parking lot every few seconds. Frank's old pickup truck was nowhere in sight. Sarah finally picked up the envelope. My first instinct was to tell her not to open it. Frank believed handwritten words deserved patience. But breakfast service would begin in less than 20 minutes, and more than 60 guests would soon be expecting the meal they trusted us to provide every Sunday. She carefully unfolded the letter. Her eyes moved slowly across the page before she looked back at us with unexpected calm. "It says," she whispered, "Good morning, my friends. Today the breakfast belongs to you." No explanation followed, no apology, no request for sympathy. Just one final sentence written beneath the signature we all knew so well. "Open the wooden recipe box only after everyone has eaten." The room became even quieter than before. I looked toward the old oak cabinet where Frank kept 15 years of carefully organized recipe cards. Until that moment, none of us had ever questioned why he locked it at the end of every Sunday. Now, for the first time, I realized the recipes might not have been the only thing he had been protecting. Breakfast began almost on time, although none of us moved with the quiet confidence Frank always seemed to carry. Sarah stood at the griddle while Marcus scrambled eggs with determined concentration, and I poured coffee for the growing line of veterans, widows, and families who depended on these Sunday mornings, as much for conversation as for food. A few guests asked where Frank was. We answered honestly that he had left us instructions but no explanation. No one complained. Instead, several people quietly looked toward his empty chair before carrying their trays to the familiar tables. Somehow, that single empty seat became the busiest place in the room, because everyone's eyes returned to it sooner or later. By the time the last biscuit had been served, the tension inside the kitchen had softened into thoughtful silence. We cleaned the counters exactly the way Frank had taught us, wiping every surface before putting away a single pan. Only after the dining room emptied did Sarah carry the small brass key hanging inside the pantry door. None of us had realized until that morning that it fit the lock on the old wooden recipe box. She unlocked it slowly and lifted the lid. Instead of finding stacks of ordinary recipes, We discovered hundreds of carefully arranged index cards separated by handwritten dividers. Each divider carried a person's first name rather than the name of a meal. Marcus picked up the first card. Across the top it read, Walter. Beneath a recipe for blueberry pancakes, Frank had written, his wife always made these before chemotherapy. Add extra cinnamon. Ask about his granddaughter's piano recital. Never let him sit alone. No one spoke. Sarah reached for another card. Evelyn. Attached to a recipe for vegetable soup was another note. She says she isn't hungry when she's worried about money. Pack leftovers anyway. Tell her the garden tomatoes came in early, even if they didn't. My throat tightened as I continued reading. Every card followed the same pattern. There were recipes, certainly, but beside every ingredient appeared something far more personal. Favorite birthdays, wedding anniversaries, military retirement dates, recent surgeries, job interviews, children's names, quiet victories over addiction, grief that returned every holiday season. Frank had somehow remembered every burden people carried without ever making them feel observed. Marcus finally whispered, "These aren't recipes." Sarah gently shook her head. "They're reminders." At the very bottom of the box rested a sealed bundle tied with faded blue ribbon. Across the front, Frank had written only one instruction. "Open this when you understand that breakfast was never the meal." None of us reached for the ribbon. We all knew we had not earned the right to open it yet. But tucked beneath the bundle lay one final recipe card, unlike any of the others. It contained no person's name at all. Instead, it simply read, "The first ingredient is remembering someone before they ask to be remembered." None of us touched the blue ribbon that afternoon. Frank had always believed that instructions mattered only when they were understood, instead of merely followed. So Sarah placed the sealed bundle back into the wooden recipe box, exactly where we had found it. We spent the rest of the day doing something that suddenly felt more important than cleaning the kitchen. One by one, we read the recipe cards aloud. Each card revealed another quiet glimpse into a life Frank had been carrying alongside sacks of flour and boxes of eggs. There was a recipe for apple muffins marked with the name Harold, followed by the note, "His hearing aid whistles when he laughs. Tell the joke twice if he misses the first punchline." Another card belonged to Maria, whose husband had passed away 3 years earlier. Beside a recipe for cinnamon oatmeal, Frank had written, "She still sets 2 places at home. Invite someone to sit beside her before she asks." None of those instructions had anything to do with cooking, yet every one of them somehow made breakfast taste better. Marcus leaned against the pantry door and quietly admitted, "I thought he just remembered people because he was older." Sarah smiled sadly. "No, he remembered them because he decided they were worth remembering." We continued sorting the cards until Marcus suddenly frowned. "Something doesn't fit." He held up 2 recipes with the same name. Both belonged to a veteran named Leonard, but the meals were completely different. One recommended sausage gravy because Leonard loved it. The other specifically crossed it out and substituted oatmeal with fresh fruit. We assumed Frank had simply changed the recipe over the years, until Sarah noticed the dates written in tiny pencil at the bottom. The newer card explained everything. "Doctor diagnosed heart disease. Never let him feel punished. Tell him the oatmeal is my favorite too." Frank had quietly changed the menu without allowing Leonard to believe he was losing something. Instead, he had shared the sacrifice himself. As we looked closer, the same pattern appeared again and again. Salt disappeared from recipes after blood pressure diagnoses. Softer biscuits replaced crusty bread after dental surgery. Sugar-free cobbler appeared beside notes celebrating successful diabetes checkups. Every adjustment protected someone's dignity before protecting the recipe. The more we discovered, the more impossible Frank's memory seemed. Yet another question refused to leave us alone. Why had he never trained anyone to continue this work? Late that afternoon, Sarah searched through the cabinet beneath the recipe box and found an old notebook covered with grease stains. We expected shopping lists or weekly budgets. Instead, every page contained neatly written observations from nearly 15 years of Sunday mornings. Not gossip, not medical records, just moments. Walter smiled for the first time since Christmas. Marcus stayed for coffee instead of leaving early. Evelyn accepted help carrying groceries without apologizing. Frank had measured success in restored hope, rather than meals served. Tucked inside the notebook was a folded calendar page with one date circled in red. It was next Sunday. Beneath the circle he had written only 6 words. They must learn before I return. The circled date changed everything. Until then, we had believed Frank's absence was caused by illness, an emergency, or some private hardship he simply refused to burden us with. Instead, the note suggested something entirely different. He had planned this. Not only had he expected to miss breakfast, but he had chosen the exact Sunday when the responsibility would fall completely on us. Sarah closed the notebook and rested both hands on the counter where Frank usually kneaded biscuit dough. He wasn't preparing meals, she said quietly. He was preparing us. Marcus still looked unconvinced. If that's true, why disappear? Why not just tell us? No one answered immediately because the question echoed through the kitchen more loudly than the empty room itself. Frank had spent 15 years teaching by example instead of instruction. Perhaps he believed some lessons could never be learned while the teacher remained in front of the class. During the following week, we met every evening after work. We spread the recipe cards across 3 folding tables, trying to organize them into something we could actually use. At first, we arranged them alphabetically. That failed. Then, by breakfast menu. That also failed. Finally, Sarah noticed a small colored dot into the corner of every card. Blue, green, yellow, and red. They were so small we had overlooked them entirely. We compared dozens of cards before the hidden system slowly emerged. Blue cards belonged to people grieving a recent loss. Green marked guests celebrating progress after difficult seasons. Yellow identified those who rarely asked for help, even when they desperately needed it. Red indicated someone who should never leave without another volunteer quietly checking on them later that week. Suddenly, the entire recipe box transformed before our eyes. Frank had never been organizing food. He had been organizing compassion. Every volunteer assignment, every table arrangement, every serving order had quietly followed a plan designed around people rather than efficiency. We had mistaken routine for habit when it had actually been thoughtful leadership all along. Sarah carefully unfolded another page tucked inside the notebook. It contained a hand-drawn map of the dining room. Certain chairs were circled with initials beside them. Walter always sat where sunlight reached the window because arthritis bothered his hands less in the warmth. Maria faced away from the entrance because watching couples arrive together reminded her of her late husband. Marcus stared at the map for a long time before pointing toward a corner table. That's where I always sit. Sarah looked down the page until she found his initials. Frank's note beneath them read, "Seat him where he can see everyone. Someday, he will stop feeling like a guest and start noticing who else needs company." Marcus lowered the paper without saying a word. For the first time since I had known him, the young veteran looked less like someone searching for direction and more like someone who had quietly found it. Before we left that evening, Sarah unlocked the recipe box once more. She looked at the blue ribbon resting beneath the cards but did not touch it. "Not yet," she whispered. He said we'd know when we understood. As she closed the lid, a loose envelope slipped from the back of the box and landed on the floor. Across the front, in Frank's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words that made every one of us stop breathing for a moment. If I cannot come back. Sarah picked up the envelope with both hands, but she did not open it immediately. Frank had taught us that timing could be an act of kindness. Sometimes people needed an answer right away. Sometimes they needed to become ready for it. After a long silence, she broke the seal, unfolded the single sheet of paper, and began reading aloud. If I cannot come back next Sunday, do not waste your strength looking for me. Spend it looking after each other instead. If these recipes have become only my work, then I have failed. If they become your habit of seeing people before their problems, then breakfast will never end. No one spoke for several seconds. The words carried no fear, no self-pity, and no explanation about where Frank had gone. They sounded exactly like him. Steady, practical, and always pointing towards someone else's needs. Marcus finally broke the silence. He's sick. Sarah looked at the letter again, but slowly shook her head. Maybe. But if he wanted us to know that, he would have written it. We searched the kitchen once more, not because we expected to uncover another secret, but because every shelf suddenly seemed capable of carrying one. Behind stacks of serving trays, I found a narrow binder labeled simply Sunday Follow-Up. Inside were lists of names paired with volunteers. Every assignment extended beyond breakfast. Visit after medical appointments. Call on Tuesday evenings. Deliver soup after surgery. Help repair porch steps before winter. Bring birthday pie instead of cake because arthritis made cutting cake difficult. The breakfasts had never ended when the tables were cleared. They had quietly continued throughout the week. Sarah rested the binder against her chest. We've been volunteering one morning, she whispered. Frank has been volunteering every day. That realization landed heavily on all of us. We had admired his generosity without recognizing its true size. The food had simply opened the door. Everything meaningful happened afterward. During the next several days, we tried following the binder exactly as Frank had written it. Marcus visited Leonard, expecting to drop off groceries for a few minutes. He stayed nearly 3 hours because Leonard confessed he had not spoken to anyone since his cardiology appointment. Sarah delivered tomato soup to Evelyn, only to discover the widow had quietly stopped attending church because she no longer wanted people asking whether she was doing all right. I drove Walter to his granddaughter's piano recital, after learning he had been pretending his eyesight was too poor to drive, when in truth, he simply could not afford repairs on his old sedan. Everywhere we went, the same pattern appeared. Frank had never solved people's lives. He had simply refused to let them carry difficult seasons alone. Yet despite everything we discovered, one question refused to disappear. Where was Frank? We called hospitals, friends, and former Air Force co-workers. Everyone gave the same answer. They had not seen him for several days. There was no emergency report, no accident, no sign of distress. It felt almost as though he had stepped aside on purpose and trusted the recipe box to complete the lesson he could no longer teach himself. Late Saturday afternoon, just before the next breakfast, Marcus returned from checking the community center mailbox, carrying a small insulated food carrier. A handwritten tag hung from the handle. It read, "For tomorrow morning, warm slowly. Do not overcook the sausage gravy. Some traditions deserve another week." Beneath the tag rested one final note. Now ask yourselves one question. Who have you remembered this week before they asked to be remembered? Sunday arrived with far less fear than the week before. Though none of us pretended, we no longer hoped to see Frank's pickup truck waiting outside the community center. The parking lot remained empty except for the volunteers, who had slowly become something different during the past 7 days. We no longer came carrying only ingredients. Marcus brought an extra folding chair for Leonard, because standing had become difficult after his latest appointment. Sarah carried a bouquet of fresh flowers that Evelyn could take home instead of leaving another empty vase on her dining room table. I arrived with Walter's repaired car keys tucked safely into my jacket pocket after several local mechanics quietly donated the labor. Before a single pan warmed on the stove, we gathered around the recipe box once more. Sarah untied the faded blue ribbon at last. None of us stopped her, because we finally understood what Frank had meant. The lesson had never been hidden inside the box. It had been unfolding inside us all week. The bundle contained 12 blank recipe cards and 1 handwritten page. "If you are reading this," Frank had written, "then someone has already been remembered before asking. That means breakfast is alive. These blank cards belong to people I have not met yet. Leave room for names I never had the privilege of learning." Marcus slowly ran his thumb across one of the empty cards. "He expected us to continue writing," he whispered. Sarah nodded. "Not copying him, continuing him." We placed the blank cards inside the box before opening the doors to our guests. Something remarkable happened that morning. The volunteers no longer waited for instructions. Marcus quietly moved Leonard's chair into the sunlight without being reminded. Sarah packed extra soup for Evelyn before she politely declined it. I noticed a new visitor standing alone near the entrance, staring uncertainly at the crowded room. Instead of asking whether he wanted breakfast, I simply walked over and introduced myself. His name was Daniel, a recently retired firefighter who admitted he had almost turned around twice in the parking lot because he disliked feeling like a charity case. I remembered Frank's first lesson immediately. We served him coffee before asking any questions. By the end of breakfast, he was laughing with veterans he had met only an hour earlier. The room felt different, not because Frank was absent, but because pieces of his quiet way of seeing people had begun appearing in everyone else. Just as we finished cleaning the kitchen, a familiar engine echoed across the parking lot. Every conversation stopped. Through the front window, we watched Frank's weathered pickup slowly pull into its usual space. He stepped out carefully, leaning on a cane none of us had ever seen before. He looked thinner than before, but his gentle smile had not changed. None of us rushed toward him. Somehow, that no longer seemed like the lesson he wanted. Instead, Sarah carried the wooden recipe box outside and placed it in his hands. Frank looked inside, paused when he saw the 12 blank cards resting beside the original recipes, and smiled more broadly than any of us had ever witnessed. He closed the lid without saying a word. Then he looked at each of us and quietly asked, "Tell me about the people you remembered this week." In that single question, we realized the breakfast had finally become ours. Frank never answered our questions immediately. He invited us back into the kitchen, hung his faded apron on its familiar hook, and slowly lowered himself into the chair that had stood empty for 2 Sundays. The cane rested beside him, but he did not seem embarrassed by it. If anything, he appeared relieved that we finally noticed he was no longer trying to carry every burden alone. He looked around the room with the quiet satisfaction of someone inspecting a garden after trusting others to tend it. "Tell me about Daniel," he said first. Marcus smiled. "He came back this morning before sunrise." Frank nodded as though he had expected exactly that answer. "And Evelyn?" Sarah answered. "She agreed to bring flowers next week instead of staying home." Again, Frank simply nodded. We each shared another story until the kitchen no longer sounded like volunteers reporting accomplishments. It sounded like neighbors celebrating one another's small victories. When the room finally grew quiet, Sarah gently asked the question all of us had been carrying. "Why didn't you tell us where you were?" Frank folded his hands across the table before answering. "Because you would have spent your energy taking care of me." He glanced toward the recipe box. "I needed to know whether you'd keep taking care of everyone else." Then he explained the truth. Several weeks earlier, his physician had insisted he undergo treatment for a worsening hip condition that had left him relying on a cane. Recovery would eventually keep him away from the kitchen, whether he liked it or not. For the first time in 15 years, Frank realized the breakfast depended too much on one pair of hands. He feared the tradition might quietly disappear the day he no longer unlocked the building before sunrise. Instead of waiting for that day to arrive unexpectedly, he created one himself. "Service that cannot survive one person," he said softly, "was never really service. It was dependence." His words settled over us with surprising peace rather than guilt. None of us felt criticized. We felt trusted. Just then, Leonard slowly walked into the kitchen, carrying a small wooden plaque. Behind him came Evelyn with fresh flowers, Walter with a box of repaired coffee mugs, Daniel wearing an apron he had purchased the night before, and dozens of regular guests who somehow managed to squeeze into every available corner. Sarah looked at Frank and smiled. "We may have ignored one instruction." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" "You told us not to waste time looking for you." She laughed gently. "We didn't. We spent it finding each other." Leonard stepped forward and placed the plaque on the wall above the old recipe cabinet. It did not carry Frank's name. Instead, carved into polished oak were the words, "Remember people before they ask to be remembered." Frank stared at the plaque for several long seconds before quietly wiping away a tear. "That's better," he whispered. "Names fade. Habits stay." Marcus then reached into the recipe box and removed one of the blank cards. In careful handwriting, he filled in Daniel's name. Under the recipe for scrambled eggs, he added a single sentence: "Always greet him before he wonders whether he belongs." Frank watched without interrupting. The box no longer belonged to him. It belonged to everyone willing to notice another person's quiet need. As the final guests drifted home that afternoon, the kitchen felt strangely unchanged. The same coffee pot steamed in the corner. The same griddle cooled beside the window. The same empty chair remained tucked against the wall. Only now every one of us understood that it would never truly be empty again. Months passed, and the Sunday breakfasts slowly became known for something that had nothing to do with the food. People still came for pancakes, biscuits, and hot coffee, but they stayed because someone always noticed when a familiar face failed to appear. The recipe box continued growing, one handwritten card at a time. New names joined old ones. Some belonged to veterans. Others belonged to teachers, firefighters, nurses, young parents, or widowers who had wandered through the doors believing they were simply looking for breakfast. Every card followed the same unwritten promise Frank had quietly lived for years. Learn the person's story before trying to solve the person's problem. One crisp autumn morning, Frank unlocked the kitchen as usual, only to discover someone else had already started the coffee. Marcus had arrived an hour early because Daniel was helping a new volunteer learn the pancake batter. Sarah was arranging flowers on every table while Evelyn laughed with guests near the serving line. Frank smiled to himself and quietly hung his apron on the hook without saying a word. No one had asked him what needed to be done. They simply saw what needed doing. That had become the new tradition. Before breakfast began, Sarah gathered everyone together. "We have one more surprise." She opened the recipe box and removed a leather-bound journal with blank pages. Across the cover, embossed in simple gold letters, were the words, "The Sunday Book." Inside the first page, she had copied one sentence from Frank's original notes. Remember people before they ask to be remembered. Beneath it, every volunteer had signed a single promise. I will notice who is missing. I will remember what matters. I will leave room for someone new. Frank traced the cover with weathered fingers before quietly closing the journal again. This is better than a recipe, he said. Recipes feed people for a morning. Habits feed communities for generations. As winter settled over the town, the breakfasts became larger than anyone had imagined. Children drew handmade cards for lonely veterans. High school students shoveled driveways for widows whose names appeared on new recipe cards. Retired mechanics quietly repaired vehicles for neighbors who could not afford the work. The kitchen remained the beginning, never the destination. One snowy Sunday, a young volunteer asked Frank why he never placed his own recipe card inside the box. Frank smiled, looked around the room filled with conversations, laughter, and steaming coffee, then gently shook his head. Because if I need my own card, he answered, it means all of yours are missing. The young volunteer thought about that answer for a long moment before slipping a blank card back into the box. Instead of writing Frank's name, he finally understood. The greatest legacy was never becoming unforgettable. It was helping other people feel impossible to forget. Years later, long after Frank permanently retired from standing behind the griddle, the breakfast continued every single Sunday. The old wooden recipe box became worn smooth from thousands of caring hands. Some of the original cards faded with age, but no one replaced them. Their worn edges reminded every volunteer that kindness grows stronger through use, not perfection. Visitors occasionally asked who had started the tradition. The volunteers always smiled and pointed toward the recipe box instead of a photograph. They knew the story mattered more than the storyteller. Because of one retired Air Force cook who missed a single Sunday breakfast on purpose, an entire community learned that the most important ingredient was never flour, butter, or coffee. It was the quiet decision to remember another human being before they ever had to ask. And every Sunday morning, before the first pancake touched the griddle, someone still opened the recipe box, chose one blank card, and silently wondered whose name would change the story next. Thank you for spending this time with silent honor. If Frank's quiet lesson reminded you of someone who always noticed others before themselves, share their story in the comments. Your memories may become the encouragement someone else needs today. If stories like this remind you that dignity often grows through the smallest acts of kindness, we would be honored to have you subscribe and join us again next Sunday. Until then, may you find one person to remember before they ever have to ask.